Hello, and welcome to Edupedia World. In the last session, we had focused on important tools managers use to select employees. Now we will turn to one of these tools, which is interviewing candidates. The main topics that we're going to be covering include the types of interviews, things that undermine interviewing usefulness, and designing and conducting effective selection interviews. And at the end, I will also be giving you a few guidelines and tips on how to be an effective interviewee. Now, before proceeding, we should answer an obvious question. If the interview is only one of several selection tools, why devote a whole chapter to this one tool? One answer is that interviews are the most widely used selection procedure. And not all managers use tests or even reference checks. And it would also be very unusual if you do not interview someone before hiring him or her, right? The other answer is that most people think that they are better interviewers than they really are. And in one study, less than 34% of interviewers had formal training, for instance, in how to structure an interview. So let's take a look at the lesson. Now there are three types of interviews, namely the selection interview, appraisal interview, and the exit interview. Now what is an interview? Let's answer that question first. So an interview is more than a discussion, right? It is basically a procedure that is designed to obtain information from a person through oral responses and oral inquiries. Now, a selection interview is a procedure designed to predict an applicant's future job performance based on their oral responses or oral inquiries. Now, we will be looking at the other two interviews, which is the appraisal interview and the exit interview in future chapters. But to give you a small gist of what it is, an appraisal interview is a discussion following a performance appraisal in which a supervisor and employee discuss the employee's ratings and possible remedial actions. And when an employee leaves a firm, often an exit interview is conducted, right? And this basically, the aim of an exit interview is to obtain information that might provide some insight into what's right or what's wrong about the firm. Now in this particular session, we are going to be discussing selection interview in particular. We'll be discussing the other two in future chapters. So, features of a selection interview, right? They're classified into three. One is how structured is the interview. Second is their content, the types of questions they contain. And third is how the firm administers these interviews. So, interview structure, that is the first part. It is either a structured interview or an unstructured interview. And you would have probably seen that some selection interviews are more structured or methodical than others are in your experience, right? In an unstructured interview, the manager follows no set format. And a few questions might be specified in advance, but they're usually not. And there is no formal guide for scoring right and wrong answers. It is basically a little more than a general conversation, right? It is described as that. Whereas a structured interview, the employer lists the questions way ahead of time. And he or she would also list and score possible answers for appropriateness. So, one of the early examples is McMurray's patterned interview, in which the interviewer followed a printed form to ask a series of questions, right? And usually what happens in a structured interview is that the entire panel that asks or does the interview for the candidate, they follow the same set of questions. So which one do we use, right? Of course, it's a no-brainer. There is no doubt that structured interviews are superior. In structured interviews, all interviews generally ask all applicants the same questions. And partly because of this, these interviews tend to be more reliable and valid. And they also help less talented interviewers conduct better interviews. So standardizing the interview also increases the consistency across candidates, and they reduce overall subjectivity and therefore the potential for bias. And this may enhance the ability to withstand legal challenge. So at the end, you do not want someone to feel that they've been discriminated, right? You need to try and make the interview as fair as possible. Now, interview content, which is the second part. This, we can basically classify interviews based on content or types of questions you ask. That's another way of classifying interviews. Now, probably most interviewers tend to ask relatively unfocused questions. And they might include questions like, what are your main strengths and weaknesses? What do you want to be doing 5 years from now? I'm sure most of you all have gone through these series of questions. Now, generally, questions like these don't really provide much useful insight, right, on how well the person is going to do on the job. If I come and ask you, what do you think, where are you going to be 5 years from today? I have no idea what you're going to do once you join the company, right? How are you going to perform in this particular position? That has absolutely no relation to the job. So, at work, situational, behavioral, and job-related questions are most important. So, let's go to the first type of question, that is situational questions. So, in a situational interview, you ask a candidate what his or her behavior would be in a given situation. Now, for example, you might ask a supervisory candidate how he or she would act in response to a subordinate coming late to work 3 days in a row. Right? That is an example of a situational question. Now, behavioral questions. Situational interviews ask applicants to describe how they would react to a hypothetical situation today or tomorrow. Now, behavioral interview questions ask applicants to describe how they reacted to actual situations in the past, right? So, if you take the example of the candidate, their subordinate coming in late 3 days in a row, you could probably ask if such a situation happened with them in their previous organization and how did they react to that, right? So, small example. This is an example of the Citizens Banking Corporation in Michigan. And they found that 31 of the 50 people in its call center quit in 1 year. Now, the center's head, which was Cynthia Wilson, switched to behavioral interviews. So many of those who left did so because they didn't enjoy fielding questions from occasionally irate clients. So Wilson no longer tries to predict how candidates will act based on asking them if they want to work with angry clients, right? Instead, she asked behavioral questions like, tell me about a time when you were speaking with someone who is irritated or with an angry client, right? And how you turn the situation around. So that sort of question, when you ask those sort of questions, what happens is it is very difficult for the applicant to lie, right, or to just make up answers. And also you kind of it makes it harder to fool the interviewer. And what happened after that was only 4 people left the call center in the following year. So in summary, situational questions start with phrases such as, suppose you were faced with the following situation. What would you do? And behavioral questions would start with phrases like, can you think of a time? Right? You think of a time when this happened. And then what did you do? So more employers today are using, or at least plan to use, behavioral interviews. Now the other type of questions is a job related interview, right? In a job related interview, the interviewer asks applicants questions about relevant past experiences. The questions are here don't revolve around hypothetical or actual situations or scenarios. Instead, the interviewer asks job related questions. And the aim is to draw conclusions about the candidate's ability to handle the job, right, that the employer seeks to fill. The fourth type is the stress interview, right? And this is one of the lesser used types of questions. And in this, the interviewer seeks to make the applicant uncomfortable with occasionally rude questions. And the aim is supposedly to spot sensitive applicants and those with low or high stress tolerance. And the interviewer might first probe for weakness, right, into the applicant's background, such as the job that the applicant left under questionable circumstances. And this might make the candidate feel irritated or might get defensive, or he may be able to answer under that sort of pressure. So the stress interview basically is invasive and ethically questionable. This is definitely not an approach for amateur interviewers, and also for interviews that do not require that sort of skills. Another sort of questions are the puzzle questions. Those are also extremely popular and recruiters usually use them. Moving on, administering an interview, right? How should we administer the interview? So employers also administer interviews in various ways. One method is, they have different. One is the one-on-one or by a panel of interviewers, or sequentially, or all at once, and so on. So most selection interviews are one-on-one and sequential. In a one-on-one interview, two people meet alone, and one interviews the other by seeking oral responses to oral inquiries. And employers tend to schedule these interviews sequentially. In a sequential interview, several persons interview the applicant in sequence, one-on-one, and then make their hiring decision. In an unstructured sequential interview, each interviewer generally asks questions as they come to mind. And in a structured sequential interview, each interviewer rates the candidates on a standard evaluation form, right, using standardized questions, and they have a rating evaluation form. They have a scorecard and all of that. So the hiring manager then reviews and compares the evaluation before deciding whom to hire. A panel interview is also known as a board interview. It's an interview conducted by a team of interviewers. And then they interview each candidate and then combine their ratings into a final panel score. So the panel format enables interviewers to ask follow-up questions. Basically like reporters do in press conferences. Although it's not clear whether, as a rule, panel interviews are more or less reliable and valid than sequential interviews, because how the employer actually does the panel interview would determine this. Now the next kind is phone interviews. And employers do some interviews entirely by telephone, and these can actually be more accurate than face-to-face interviews for judging an applicant's intelligence and interpersonal skills. Because here neither party need to worry about things like appearance or handshake, so each can focus on substantive answers. And candidates somewhat surprised by an unexpected call from the recruiter, they give answers that are more spontaneous. So Indian IT companies usually depend largely on phone interviews to select technical employees. Currently, this practice has been accepted by other sectors too, and such interviews are cost effective, and they provide the necessary flexibility for both interviewers and interviewees. The next type is the video or the web assisted interviews, and firms have long used the web to do selection interviews. particularly the initial pre-screening interviews. And of course, with the widespread use of Skype type products, their use is growing. The next type of interview is the computerized interviews. Some firms computerize part of the interview process, and most computerized interviews present the applicant with a series of questions regarding his or her background, the experience, education, skills, knowledge, and work attitudes that relate to the job for which the person has applied. And questions on computerized interviews come in rapid sequence, and they require the applicant to concentrate. Moving on, factors that affect or undermine interviews. So, one reason selection interviews tend to be less than useful is that managers make predictable and avoidable errors, right? And let's discuss a couple of them. And these are things that definitely can be avoided when you conduct interviews. So, first one is first impressions or snap judgments. So, the most consistent research finding is that interviewers tend to jump to conclusions. They make snap judgments about candidates during the first few minutes of the interview. And one researcher estimates that in 85% of the cases, interviewers had made up their minds before the interview even began, based on first impressions. And the interviewers gleaned from candidates' applications and personal appearance, right? First impressions are especially damaging when the prior information about the candidate is negative. The second is not clarifying what the job requires, right? The misunderstanding of the job. So, interviewers who don't have an accurate picture of what the job entails and what sort of candidate is best suited for the job is usually someone who makes the decisions based on incorrect impressions or stereotypes of what a good applicant is. The other kind of mistake interviewers make is candidate order, contrast error, and pressure to hire. So what this actually means is that the order in which you see applicants affects how you rate them. So in one study, managers had to evaluate candidates who were just average. So after first evaluating several unfavorable candidates, they scored the average candidate more favorably than they might have otherwise done. Because in contrast to those other unfavorable candidates, the average one looked really good, right? And much better than he actually was. So pressure to hire also increases this problem. Then we have non-verbal behavior and impression management. So the applicant's non-verbal behavior, basically like smiling, avoiding your gaze and so on, can also have a surprisingly large impact on his or her rating. Then what is impression management, right? Clever candidates actually capitalize on that fact. And for instance, the interviewers praise them or appear to agree with their opinions. So agreeing with the recruiter's opinions and signaling that they share those similar beliefs, that kind of can deviate the interviewer's impression on the candidate. And the interviewers make self-promoting comments about their own accomplishments. And self-promotion means promoting one's own skills and abilities to create that impression of competence. So it's basically all an impression, right? It may not be the right impression, it may not be what the candidate actually is, but the interviewee basically tries to put on a mask, and you'll end up hiring the wrong person. So next point is effect of personal characteristics, and these are basically characteristics like attractiveness, gender, race, and so on. So unfortunately, physical attributes of applicants, they may distort the assessment of the interviewer. So for example, when you ask people, based on research, a successful life or favorable traits, those usually are pointed towards attractive people. So subjects had to evaluate candidates for promotion based on photographs, and they perceived men as being more suitable for hire and more likely to advance to a next executive level than they did equally qualified women. So they preferred more attractive candidates, especially men, to lesser attractive ones. Even though female managers exhibited the same career advancing behaviors, they still earned less money and were offered few career progressing transfer opportunities. Another study, for example, the white members of a racially balanced interview panel, they rated white candidates higher, whereas a panel of black interviewers rated black interviews higher. Even unfortunately cases where disabilities, right, such as childcare demands, HIV positive status, wheelchair bound, they had less chance of obtaining a positive decision as well. So these are things which we can definitely avoid when we conduct interviews. Then we have interviewer behavior. So that's the final factor. Now, the interviewer's behavior also affects the interviewer's performance and rating. Right now, some interviewers talk so much that the applicants have no time to answer, and some on the other extreme, there are some interviews let the applicant dominate the interview, and so they don't ask all their questions. So, when interviewers have favorable pre-interview impressions of the applicant, they tend to act more positively towards that person. So, smiling more, for instance. And possibly because they want to increase the chance that the applicant will accept the job. And other interviewers tend to, play district attorney. And it's smart to be alert for inconsistencies, but it is quite uncivil also to sort of treat the candidate in a very aggressive manner. Next, we have how to design and conduct an effective interview, right? So, the first point is analyze the job. And this is something we had discussed in an earlier session. Write a job description with the list of job duties required, knowledge, the skills, the abilities, and other work qualifications. Next, you need to rate the job's main duties. This means identify the job's main duties, and to do so, rate each job duty based on the importance to the job success and the time required to perform it compared to other tasks. Then create interview questions. So create them based on actual job duties with more questions for the important duties. And then recall the situational questions. Right? We discussed about situational questions, behavioral questions, job-related questions. So make sure that your set of questions basically contain all of these types of interview questions. Next comes the we'll create benchmark answers. Yeah. So for each question, develop an ideal benchmark. That is, answers for good. For the good answer, make a 5-star rating, right? And write down what you would consider as a good answer. If it's a marginal answer, a 3 rating, and if it's poor, then of course a 1 rating. Then you need to appoint the interview panel and conduct the interviews. So employers generally conduct structured situational interviews using a panel rather than one-on-one, and the panel usually consists of 3 to 6 members, preferably the same ones who wrote the questions and answers. And it may also include the job's supervisor. Now, how to conduct an effective interview? Now, once you have designed the interview, right, an effective interview, how do you, once you interview a candidate, how do you make sure you're conducting an effective interview? So first is you need to make sure that you know the job, right? Do not start the interview unless you understand the job and what sort of skills you're looking for. And you need to study the job description and understand what sort of skills the ideal employee in the job should have. Next is structure the interview. So any structuring is usually better than none. So if you're pressed for time and you don't have time to structure your interview, you can do several things to be a little more consistent. First is, base your questions on actual job duties, right? This will minimize irrelevant questions. Then you need to use your job knowledge, situational questions, your behavioral questions. Basically try and write down a couple of those questions, before you start the interview. Next is you need to use the same questions with all the candidates. Now what happens is this becomes more standardized and it improves the reliability of the interview. And finally, you need to, create a descriptive rating scale, the one that I just told you about, which is, the excellent rating, fair rating, and the poor rating. You need to get organized before the interview starts. That is, first, the interview should take place in a private room where telephone calls are not accepted, and you can minimize interruptions. And prior to the interview, review the candidate's application and resume, and note any areas that are vague or that may indicate strengths or weaknesses. Establish a rapport. The main reason for interview is to find out about the applicant. And to do this, start by putting the person at ease. Greet the candidate, start asking, questions, very non-controversial questions. Something like, talk about the weather or traffic conditions, things like that. And finally, ask questions, right? Try to follow the situational, behavioral, and job knowledge questions that you had wrote out ahead of time. And don't ask questions that the candidate can just answer with a yes or no. Don't put words in the applicant's mouth. Don't interrogate the applicant like you're some police officer and you've put the person on trial. And don't monopolize the interview just by rambling and not letting the applicant talk. And don't let the applicant dominate either. And do ask open-ended questions, right? Listen to the candidate, encourage him or her to express their thoughts fully. Next is take brief notes during the interview. Now, doing so, you avoid making snap decisions based on inadequate information early in the interview. And it may also help jog your memory once the interview is complete. And finally, close the interview. Leave time to answer any questions the candidate may have. And try to end the interview on a positive note. And review the interview. After the candidate leaves, review your interview scores, notes, the interview guide answers. Review the interview while it's still fresh. Don't try to review the interview after a week or 2 weeks, because you may actually forget what you thought about the candidate. And finally, before we come to an end to this lesson, I'd like to give you a few guidelines on an interview, because so far we've been discussing on how to conduct an interview. But if you are on the other side or the other end of the table, what you need to do to prepare yourself. So first thing, preparation is essential. Before the interview, you need to learn all you can about the employer and the job, the people who are doing the recruiting, and try and look through business periodicals or the web or the library and find out what is happening in the employer's field and who its competition are and how are they doing, and be ready to explain why you think you will be able to solve those problems, right? Next is uncover the interviewer's real needs. So spend as little time as possible answering the first few questions. The first few questions would be warm-up questions by the interviewer. So don't keep talking about random things. Try and keep that short. And as an interview, try and spend as much time as possible getting him or her to describe their needs, right? What sort of person they're looking for, what sort of job they're trying to close here, and use open-ended questions, right? Like, could you tell me more about that? And then relate yourself to the interviewer's needs. So once you know the type of person your interviewer is looking for and the sort of problems that they have in their department or in that particular division, then you are in a good position to describe your accomplishments. And then you could start by saying something like, one of those problem areas that you just spoke about, that is quite important. I once faced a similar situation. And then probably you can describe on how you handle that situation. That would really impress the interviewer. Think before answering, right? Answering the question should be a 3-step process. So one is pause, think, and then speak. So pause to make sure you understand what the interviewer is asking. Think about how you're going to structure your answer, and then speak. Remember that appearance and enthusiasm is important, right? Appropriate clothing, good grooming, a firm handshake, energy. You need lots of energy. Don't be dull. And of course, your non-verbal behavior also may broadcast more about you than your verbal content. So maintain eye contact. And in addition, when you speak with enthusiasm. You nod in agreement. And remember, take a moment to frame your answer, right? The pause, think, speak. And finally, make a first good impression. Studies show that in most cases, what we discussed, unfortunately, interviewers make up their minds about the applicant during the early minutes of the interview. So a good first impression may turn too bad during the interview, but that's very unlikely. But bad first impressions are almost impossible to overcome. So make sure that you make a good first impression. And finally, always take time to ask questions, because it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. You would also like to know more about the company, what sort of job, that you would be, what kind of responsibilities you would be handling, so you're prepared before you decide in case they offer you the job. And, ask questions like, when can you expect to hear from them? Or whether they would like a list of references, or things like, what's the growth plan for the company? Do I need to travel for this job? Things like that, so that you're also prepared before they make up their mind. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the session. In the next session, we're going to learn about training and developing employees, and how to make sure your new employees have the skills they need to perform their jobs. So thank you, and stay tuned for the next session.